Cornucopia, welcome to the show. The red sky and bomb-shot walls disappeared into a brown mental slur as we trotted down the stone staircase. It led us deep under the road and into the subterranean world of aqueducts and sewers that supply and cleanse the eternal city. With the ancient wall paintings firmly etching the outline of star people into our minds, the flagstones, wide and proud, swept us around and down into a grave, dusky strangeness. When I looked up, rail cars covered with brainwashing images of sprayed theme park walls and the vast ruinous temple of a lost goddess streamed down from the steel and glass pyramids above. Under the flaming torches, the streets swarmed with life of all shapes and sizes. There were the criminal elements, the knife-point thieves, the pickpockets, the blind beggars, and the strange merchants of every creed and colour, and the gypsies, who ditched the side shutters from their caravan and pitched their elixirs to suckers and stooges that stood around coughing and spitting, whilst in tribute to some deity, beautiful young women stood very still, dressed in fine lace, to begin carving out careers as living sculptures. Wild animals on ropes were pulled along by circus performers, while the very special people who travelled with the fair juggled batons of fire and blew flames at the tent show queens. The more girly unisons waited inside, ready to sell themselves. It was written all over their faces, "You could buy me with a bunch of flowers." The rhinal blast of urine coming from the lifts mixed with the odoriferous sulphine seeping from the road above and caused a watery discharge to dribble from my nose. Bruce ran off to explore. I wouldn't see him for the next hour. When I looked down, the torch flames revealed the imperfections in the structure. There were irregularities in the alignment of the stones and in the orientation of the site as a whole. In the gaps where the workmanship had been careless, black rats congregated to sniff the air. What with that and the grimy bedsheets gently billowing in the smut like busty sails of a stolen ship, I could only describe the place as bizarre. More like a scruffy, chaotic circus place than a cultural centre. I thought more a spiral than the upper classes could sink down into to enjoy their political disputes, orgies, and the daily bathing that set them apart from the heathens above. The Crow's Nest. It would appear that the king had felt inclined to encourage the sale of sex as an outlet for instincts that hadn't already been suppressed by castration at Lindholm Research Centre. It didn't matter too much, so long as it was well protected. Secret. Joyless for the unisons, with one stipulation, that the chief pimp only offered females of a submerged class. In fact, the only crime there was defined as a serious relationship between unison and human. In all matters of a genealogical nature, they, above all, were expected to follow their ancestral code. The aim of the king was to prevent humans and hybrids forming partnerships that he might not be able to control, and, as always, betrayal there equalled cash. Anyone would sell you out for a few silver coins. Once it was discovered that a cross-species relationship had blossomed, the FET would be ordered to kill the love gene and carry out the chemical sterilization of all parties involved. With the smell of preservatives and animal ejaculate permeating the air, the subterranean world of Ingold Mills was Ituria's dirty little secret. So long as everyone there worked, paid their taxes, and allowed the king's voice to fill up the horizon of their minds, life was good, down in the half-light, and as a result, sex workers in leather scurried about, their faces lit with the promise and pressure of a business that was booming beyond comprehension. On the king's birthday, Ingoldsmills was proclaimed a republic, and it became necessary to elect a PR man. There was only one candidate, Cornuco, the man we were meeting, who'd been elected unanimously as Chief of Hedonics. The stars and psychopaths of bestiality had been hidden away in their ash mountain caves, almost as long as Etruria had been in existence. It was the one with the most spectacular views over Dacia Road, where Cornuco held court. With his fellow evolutionary misfits just across the ridge, and the Finnegans in the woods, the parties were long associated with heavy flower usage and the easy availability of young human women. As a consequence, the whole area had become ground zero for the FET's technology insects. Although Cornuco, nicknamed the Red Van Dyke, still lived behind Cave 12's forbidding bars and boulders, before his new posting, Nat Coley's most celebrated cohort seldom ventured out into his old underworld domain. The locals thought that the days when he would regularly descend the 300 or so stone steps to a subterranean bar, with his irresistible charm leaving women swooning in his wake, were long gone. But who could ever separate a leopard from his spots? On that day, he arrived at the end of the cobbled walkway in a Cadillac that looked like a 1970s spaceship, crashed there 70 years before. The smoking door came up, and a beast stood before us with eyeballs that looked as though he'd brought them in a joke shop. The chest and limbs of a Hercules, draped from head to toe in what I could only describe as Tudor Del Monte. A creature rich with a swagger that even on Carnaby Street would be looked upon as bad taste. Broad zigzags of tangerine nylon hung around his body, while the deep green cloak thrown over his shoulder was lined with crimson silk, all fastened at the neck with a single red beryl. "What a grand day," he said, as though he'd spent the whole of his life living underground. He pressed a button, and a door opened in a particularly wide tree root. Yeah, I know, it's all very rude," he added, pushing me inside the lift. With his talismanic charm and sometimes irritating braggadocio, I perceived him more as a high priest of some arcane rite than a king's functionary, paid to help you enjoy a leisurely afternoon. He quickly formed a private limited company, and had been rising to the position ever since. Inside the crow's nest, we stood under a row of CCTV screens, looking down over Cornuco's empire. Some of the walkways, carved into stone, looked as though they had been modelled on the inside of a Victorian prison. Huge metal spiral staircases served buildings with wide, barred windows, and there were metal doorways 4 landings high, all aglow with blue light that splashed the white walls, each window carefully designed to knead the primal instinct of sex shopping. He declared our visit officially open with a raised arm to the glowing pits below. "I give you Ingoldsmills Porno Arcade." We were looking at 144 brothels that incorporated an almost mind-bogglingly diverse collection of sexual pursuits, adult bookstores, steam baths, water quality variable, and antique S&M machinery. Retro Rocket. Cornuco had a not-so-silent partner, codenamed B-Mode, a highly agile tin machine, no bigger than a human hand, that answered to the name of Goldfinch. A gadget with a polymathic mind that never rested. The first time I saw him, he was dozing, quite possibly dreaming reasonably sane dreams, until the fins of the small fuel rocket he called home had its roof rattled. Without warning, Cornuco ran a claw along the cooling fins of the rocket, and the tiny ornamental creature came up like a Wurlitzer. The way he went spinning around and around on his aerial to the crackling of a short circuit was startling. Once he was standing still, I looked at his face and saw a virtual world slowly rolling across his eyes. He seems quite content there, nodding along. What do you feed him on? I asked. Oh, I like to slow him down a bit for the reckoning up, so I've been weaning him on rocket oil, he said in a matter-of-fact kind of way. A few drops in his water bowl. Slows everything down so he can modulate properly. The bright paint job on his feathers was an attention grabber. It seemed to lure me into his sparkly innocent depths and allow the transmission of precise signals. Any unsuspecting person would believe that those were novelty spots, nothing more than a dozen or so dark blue circles with red centres. But they'd been custom built to mind jam, and with additional bursts of automatic behaviour triggered by a button on his back, he frightened the hell out of Bruce. It was widely understood that Cornuco and Goldfinch operated tried and tested mind scanning techniques. Every now and then they would stare carefully at Bruce before turning to each other to exchange a knowing look. After Goldfinch had ducked again for an extended closer look, he made a salute to Cornuco, and then suddenly poured forth a torrent of song that even in the arcades was astounding. Bruce and I stood silent, fascinated. The song went on and on, around and around with astonishing pitch and clarity, never once repeating itself. Some females landed around him, keen to spend time around him during this, one of his more sophisticated croons. One particularly pretty one had arrived by his side. In order to save energy, he switched to a simpler song and began courting her at the same time with rapid rising and lowering of his eyebrows. From time to time, he paused to spread out and resettle his mechanical wings and swell his speckled breast to check himself in the rocket's gilt mirror before turning back to his audience and pouring his song into the tiny microphone. The moody ballads soon gave way to louder, faster and happier electronic tunes that were quickly taken up by the arcade's resident DJ, who stood grinning as he spun the turntables through a glass partition. At first, I thought the huge swirl on the wall was a groovy tie-dye, until it began to bounce around, the drone of the King's mothership visualised in a splash of colour. Whilst under the influence of Corny's rocket oil, Goldfinch had developed a new method for tracking skyships using a mathematical function called wavelet transfer. He jumped from Corny's shoulder and onto the control desk. "The mothership makes a sound like the strum of an electric guitar," he said. "Listen." He played the mothership's tone back to me while strumming away on his guitar. It was Goldfinch's response to new weapons of mass destruction in the business, one on intangibles such as fear and emotion. Corny gave me the rundown. "This little tin machine was innovated by introducing a data-driven approach to war. The algorithm runs to 400 pages of code." "What does that mean?" I asked him. "Every time somebody drops a word or a sign, he replaces it with the equivalent item." "So you mean—" "Yes, exactly," he said, laughing. "Every time he spots the word bomb in a sentence, he sends one over. The code helps his men acquire exactly the right amount of explosives. A key attribute in a business short of cash, Chloe. To Goldfinch, feedback isn't just to help solve the foot soldiers' frontline problems. It's used as a tool to economise." The bombs were stored behind rock-like doors in a warehouse that looked like a city in itself. 20 aisles, each one at least 15 metres high, extending from floor to ceiling. I looked up at the screens. With his automatic bomb ordering system dictating their movements, 2 stacker cranes that were balletic and jerky by turns slipped between the long aisles at a mesmerising rate. The bombs were then stacked into what Corny called aliens, black crates that were collected by robotic cranes and fired up through holes in the roots. A seamless service was one thing. Delivering bombs to terrorists when those terrorists could be anywhere from the bottom of the Cytherean Ocean to the top of Ash Mountain was a very difficult challenge, especially when an order was being received, on average, every 11 seconds. The axe and the moth. Now, to me, a creature possessed of lethal sickle claws on each foot, an electronic buzz that runs along its tail feathers, and a face that bears an unmistakable resemblance to that of a very small man, is going to be nasty, so I kept my distance. Corny noticed and tried to put my mind at rest. "He's not really an aggressive trinket," he said, trying to coax him out of strangling a moth. "In fact, he doesn't seem to have an aggressive bone in his body. When it comes to other kit, he's absurdly sentimental. I mean, he could never set a trap to kill a mouse or anything." It appeared that Goldfinch drew the line when it came to insurgents. As I watched, another moth went fluttering around Corny's nose, landed on him, and began feeding on his fur. Corny tried everything to get rid of it. Being the fiercely loyal type, Goldfinch just wanted to smash the little critter to smithereens. The huge nets that Corny used for catching butterflies were too big. The moths just drifted through. He tried sucking them up with the vacuum, but they were too quick, and aerosol sprays had no effect. Goldfinch's plan worked a treat. He lured some of the male moths into the tiny traps that he'd sprayed with female pheromones. Once the males were covered in the potion, they became immediately irresistible to the other males. It caused a sexual frenzy, with all of the bone-drain males wanting to have lots of passionate sex with the wet ones, therefore wasting precious time that could have been spent chasing females around the arcade. As if that wasn't disastrous enough for the plight of the perfectly straight moths, their short lives were cut even shorter by a whack from Goldfinch's axe guitar. The traps were heavily emblematic of his love for Corny. Sad to say, his assumption that Corny would appreciate his gesture of loyalty turned to shock when he got a ticking off from the boss who told him to stop being so cruel. Still, Corny's wink on the side readily suggested to me that cruel was their middle name, and besides his loyalty, it was as much for Goldfinch's love of singing that Corny had awarded him a lifelong partnership in the enterprise. "This is what the moths need." Corny slipped off his gun and handed it over to me. 9 shots, he said boldly. "Semi-automatic." I took the gun and did my best to look professional by weighing it in my hand and clicking the safety on and off. "I don't usually like anyone touching my gun. I feel naked without it," he said gruffly. "It's a bit lighter than my preferred model, but it'll kill all right. When you put 9 rounds in someone's back." I nodded and must have looked as though I was enjoying myself too much. His grip around my arm was as tight as a vice. When he wrenched the gun back, my arm went with it. There was no sound, just a white bloom that flared from the muzzle, and a neat keyhole shape cut in the concrete wall of the crow's nest. My wrist was twisted. I let my arm hang and flexed my fingers. Thankfully, nothing was broken. "I'm pretty good with this box of tricks," he chortled and looked down the barrel. "You have to admit, Nat Coley's boys are devious. How do they get a container full of these things into the country?" With a moth looping hysterically around his horns, he spoke of the farce. "I got off. Bust case. They didn't have a snowball's chance, not a clue as far as they know. I'm El Puro. 100%. I could feel his eyes on me. He watched intently for my reaction, and while showing us every facet of his hatred as easily as if he was holding King Helios in the palm of his hand, he spat his words like thin streams of venom. "I've listened to the feuds and the regal power plays. Don't believe a word. I know all about the king's dark secrets, his murky side. But he pays so well," he roared. With a moth looping hysterically around his horns, he spoke of the farce. "I got off. Bus case. But they didn't have a snowball's chance, not a clue as far as they know. I'm El Puro, 100%. I could feel his eyes on me. He watched intently for my reaction, and while showing us every facet of his hatred, as easily as if he was holding King Helios in the palm of his hand, he spat his words like thin streams of venom. I've listened to the feuds and the regal power plays. Don't believe a word. I know all about the king's dark secrets, his murky side. But he pays so well. Slow mojo. You know this rocket oil that you're giving to him? How does that work? I asked. Well, imagine if your body was running 1,000 times faster than anything else's, right? Everything else would seem to be moving 1,000 times slower, right? Right. You'd be able to have a closer look at what's really going on, blow by blow, wouldn't you? Yes. You would actually be the first woman to travel at 1,000 miles per hour without moving very far at all. Sounds interesting, I said. So would you like to try some? He said. Before I got the chance to answer him, he gripped my arm, and while walking at such a pace that he forced me into a trot, he began shouting a song to me as we marched up the stairs. You should try it, you should taste it, come and see the show in Cornuco slow-mo. As he chinked and ground a handful of glass fields in my face, a merry drinking party of sex workers slammed their goblets against the table. Down in one! Down in one! Down in one! They shouted at me. When I slipped over on the cobbles, Corny slackened his grip. It's all going a bit too fast for you, isn't it? Yes, I said. Well, this is the antidote, he said, calmly holding up a phial to the light of a torch flame. That's convenient, I said. It's true, he said. Trust me, in this priceless phial is the potential to think twice as fast, process information twice as fast, and have twice as much fun as you could otherwise have. That's impossible, I said. It's not, he said. Think about it. You can move at your own speed around the place. If it wasn't true, then I wouldn't have been able to complete this place in a year. As he spoke again, he looked directly into the television camera. Yes, folks, if you're a businessman backed into a corner with time running out, or you only have 24 hours to live and you have to cram everything into that last one day, this is the juice you need. Really? I said, looking at the tiny phial. That stuff really works like that. Have you been taking the oil? I puffed. I took a drop last week, he said, laughing like a mighty jester, wiping the corner of his mouth with a handkerchief. That's ancient history now. The thing is to try some for yourself. Throws all sorts of light on a nervous disposition. It'll kick the idea of sadism right into your lap. Sadism? I said. Can I try mine later? No, I was joking. It'll give you a real insight into things. It'll slow everything down. You'll feel much calmer. Take some now, Chloe, unless you happen to be afraid. It's dangerous, I said. I can tell by your eyes. They're all over the place. It's fine, honestly. Listen. I'm not a wizard, you know. Can't work magic. This stuff's tried and tested. It's ancient rocket science. It's pure logic. Oh, forget it, he said, then promptly tucked the files back into his tunic and disappeared. That's when it happened. It felt as though a black belt in mind control wasn't just turning tables over to get to me. It was kicking them out of the way. In a second, a shadowy atmosphere had wrapped itself around me, cutting my senses off from everything around. Dark clouds, with the flames of an arsonist for eyes, came billowing around me, perplexing me into a standstill. A voice boomed at me from all sides. "It's only for the chosen few, and those worthy of acceptance. It's the finest brew there is. It's been sent to help the fallen, of whom I am chief." His message was delivered to my mind in milliseconds, and now vivid colours were showering my thoughts into submission. I couldn't move at all for some time. Like a frightened victim, I slowly began to succumb to his will. Why not just try a little drop? If only for the crack, I was thinking. Will it really do me good? I said. "No. It's consistent with the lowest bad," he whispered in a growl. "It's totally toxic and it will bring you to old age before your time." "Oh," I said. "But you will have lived twice the life," he added with an impish grin. "I suppose that's fair then," I said. And then, in his loudest bellow, "And that's why you're here for, isn't it? To live twice the life." When I said, "Okay," he let out a deep sigh. His plump hand slowly stretched out toward me. I took a file, snapped the top off it, and knocked it back, chasing it down with a long swig from Corny's flask. The lump in my throat made me heave. He held my arm and raised the flask. "To Cornuco Arcade!" he shouted. "Up to the roots!" "To Cornuco Arcade," I said, still trying to swallow the foul-tasting brew. "Have you swallowed it properly?" he called after me. "Yes," I said. "All of it?" "Yes," I said. "All of it." He yanked me back and had me stick out my tongue while he looked inside my mouth. While I was waiting for the effect to take a hold, Corny sat me down in the gutter. "Now listen. Don't let everything rush in at once," he said. "The sense of vision will be quite different, as though the wheels of time are grinding everything to a halt. Open your eyes too quickly, and the gravitational pull can make you feel a bit sick. So, very slowly." "Okay," I said, not feeling anything. "And another thing," he said, "keep very still. Don't thrash about. You might hurt yourself." I'm okay," I said. "I'm seated. I'm fine. I'm fine." After a while, I closed my eyes, his words trailed off, and somebody slammed a very heavy foot on the accelerator. Have you ever fallen into the deep black non-existence of a mine shaft? That was very much how it felt. For exactly how long I was like that, I have no idea. My mind was completely empty. There was nothing really on the way down. Maybe a slight feeling of elation, but nothing to write home about. I opened my eyes to Cornuco's clicking of fingers. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Everything feels fine." That was the truth. I felt perfectly normal, very light and confident on the surface. But deep inside, it felt as though a steam locomotive was driving every one of my body parts. "So, what now?" I asked him. "Watch this," he said. I suppose it was something close to a miracle. When he opened his hand, the hip flask he was holding clung to the air, just hung there, motionless. "Roughly speaking," he said, "down here. A flask should fall at roughly 20 feet in 1 second. This flask is falling incredibly fast. That should give you some idea of the speed that we are travelling at now." "We?" I said. "Well, of course. You don't think I'd trust you to come here on your own, do you?" He moved his hand over and around the slowly sinking flask like a magician. Finally, like an astronaut drawing down his lunch from zero gravity, he took the flask at the bottom, pulled it down, and placed it back into his pocket. "Fast enough?" he asked. "Yes, that should be fast enough," I said, slowly turning towards the action. Freeze frame. That was the weirdest part. Everyone seemed to be frozen solid. When I looked at Bruce, he was standing quite still, with a small mushroom cloud of smoke pinned to the end of his nose. I waved my hand in front of his face. Nothing. Through a window, I saw one actress, quite rigid, head down, with a hard-boiled lump of gristle wedged against the inside of her cheek, set to drain a loin that didn't move a muscle. I gawped in amazement at a young man devoted to pleasure, exposed and ready to push his luck as far as his money would take him, barely moving an inch. With a great capitalist last of incessant growth, Corny walked right up to the pair, stared them right in the eyes, and trying to put some motion back in their limbs, teased them with an appeal to their ambitions. "If you really want to make Porn Couple of the Year, you'll have to work faster than that. Come on!" When I next saw Corny, he was skipping across the cobbles like a kid with an ice cream. I asked him straight, could he really see himself working in the industry up to retirement? His eyes sparkled, and he sent up a great purple cloud of triumph from his cigar. "When you're as open-minded about sadomasochism as I am, and have spoken to practitioners and appreciate the athleticism and creativity involved, it doesn't ruffle your feathers so much. But I admit there are going to be people who see a man strung up like the last celebration bird in a shop window dangling before a sexually aroused businessman as an image of aggressive disrespect. Oh, there'll always be humorless people around." When I looked behind him through a window, there was certainly athleticism involved, in the full twisted count the legs and divide by 2 sense. "What do you think went wrong with you and your Tiffany?" I asked him. He made his answer to the camera lens that followed him everywhere. "Us men try to act so tough, like emperors with their 40 wives. They couldn't satisfy their own hand. A woman should have a harem of male acrobats that they could handle. The sex drive of a woman is more powerful than a man's. Take this to the bank, folks," he said, winking at the camera, "because Uncle Cornuco doesn't lie to you. When you get into your mid-40s, a young woman can smoke you under the rubber mat. Trust me. They'll destroy you and your friends, if you're that liberated." He turned his attention back to me. "What Tiffany needed was that special time, when it's just you and them 1 or 2 nights a week. If you don't do that, your marriage is screwed." "Would you be jealous if you saw her with another man?" I asked. "Oh, if she had sex with some guy, I wouldn't be jealous. If she walked on the beach, holding hands, or sat by a fire and had wine, I'd kill 'em both. A little nookie, who cares? Kiss and cuddle and we've got a problem. To tell you the truth, I couldn't let her go completely." "How do you mean?" I asked. "Well, I kept part of her," he said with an almost sincere look in his eyes. "Oh, God, don't tell me." At this, He pulled a pair of ladies' pants from his pocket. "Yes, sirree. I'll never love anything as much as ladies' drawers, man." That was his compromise, his coping mechanism. "It's not possible to live without wearing them and do my job." After fantasizing obsessively about how it would feel to be reunited with Tiffany, he got himself in a right tiswas, tossed the lemon pants around his horn, and began singing. "I wake up absolutely raging with desire. My longing for you is intense. I'm loving and adoring and wanting you so." Clearly confounded by his own ardour, with his fists clasped tightly to his chest, he went about trying to explain. "I do really love and worship you, my little jewel kin. I am only existing till I see you again, and only just managing to do that." Bruce turned up, looking out of breath. There was a long pause, followed by a longer one. He laughed weakly, and with his eyes 2 revelations of guilt, he tried to speak about his experience, but the words just wouldn't come out. The overhead speakers came alive with a message from the King's chambers. The voice claimed that within the hour, the King had put his signatures on the death warrants of 2 hardcore terrorists, and while hanging had been the usual means of dispatch, in an expression of the issue having been taken up on a war footing, it was added that the terrorists responsible will face the guillotine. Under the tiny burst of steam that puffed from his nostrils, he smouldered in a particularly mordacious way. "Every time there's an atrocity, apologists for the King will put it down to a Cypherian conspiracy rather than admit that the people who he believes adore him," and then rounded it all off by lashing through the smoke rings he blew with a talon, "actually want him dead." I didn't speak. I watched Bruce from the corner of my eye. The triumphant atmosphere had fallen away from Cornuco's expression, and it was grimmer than it had been all day. He remained deathly silent. His thoughts, many that they were, lay silent on the warpaths of his mind, while his dull eyes roamed around from doorway to alley to open window, as though he expected a change to come through any opening. The terror that came to his face was shot through by a streak of ordinary embarrassment. It seemed to him quite possible that he'd made a stupid mistake. There was a flash of pain in his eyes, and eventually I could see that the single hope founded on a dream was broken. I heard the air coming out of him, a long, resigned sigh that said, "We're gonna get necked." He took out his burn tin, flipped open the lid, licked a pair of papers together, and sliding down the wall, he crashed on the cobbles. As he puffed away, the smoke wound itself together, bottlenecked and curled into a snaking ripple that seeped up through the leg of a pair of bloomers hanging from a rude window. With the end of the roly glowing red and true, his grim face broke down into what might have been the beginning of a smile. He resettled the joint a few more times between his teeth and tensed his biceps hard before speaking. "As men bring war into the world, so death from the sky will pass over them." He took out his book, The 12 Ways of the Silent Killer, and began turning the pages, still talking to himself. "Have welcome in your eye, your hand, your tongue. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent underneath." Cornuco tucked away the lemon pants in his back pocket and sniffed the air through quivering nostrils. Suddenly, a beam of light burst in through the soil and roots, and the whole area was in commotion. People were jumping out of windows and diving down through trapdoors like frightened animals, and there were nervous yells of warning as they darted around looking for shelter. An ashen-faced man, swathed in a dark cloak, stepped out of a doorway with a torch to lead the way deeper into the underground. 20 metres ahead, the doors of a poppy shop swung open. The aroma of pipe oils and the sour smell of stale vegetation filled the air as the last few pieces of broken windows tinkled to the floor. All in one movement, a young man leapt out of a doorway, grabbed a tiny exotic dancer, whipped her into a suitcase, and dashed back into a doorway. In the same moment, Cornuco had whipped a black balaclava over his face and was running back towards us, pointing excitedly at the sky. "Skyship!" he yelled. "Skyship!" Bruce screamed, "Look out, Miss Chloe! Lay down! Lay down!" He promptly flung himself on the floor and covered his ears. There was a roar that made the ground heave, and one huge eruptant blast sent fragments of tree roots shooting off in all directions. When we all stood up, we were covered from head to toe in white powder and silver metal fragments. The ray of light had demolished the poppy shop, and I could see out through the holes that the silver smoke hanging in the sky had begun forming clouds around the pyramids. An amalgam of fine silvery dust and powdered charcoal swirled around us. Layer upon layer settled on roofs and collected in the potholes, forming hoary pools of precious metal that we began stumbling across to get out of the place. Equinox. Cornuco began leading us towards the place where he'd first met Tiffany, and as we stepped down the spiral staircase, he added a certain briskness to his walk. It caused a friction about his trousers that I hadn't heard before. When I looked between his knees, I saw it. I think that was the freakiest part of him. A thin, red tail with a sharp, angular barb on the end of it. As I walked around him, looking at the end of his tail, he began walking around me, looking for mine. That's when he spotted the bulge in my clothes. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the protrusion in my coat. "What's what?" I said, trying to look innocent. "Just over there to the right," he pointed. "One look at a girth like that, and I think that's a woman who eats a lot of, let me guess, rattlesnake sausages." "It's a collider," I said, trying to hide the scope as it flashed uncontrollably. "Let me see it," he said. I held out the collider, and without loosening my grip, let him take a closer look. "Let me tell you something," he said as his eyes began to widen and range through their spectrum of colours. "I've seen one of these things before. Now, what's this one do?" he said, trying to twist the collider out of my hand. As his fascination grew, his grip tightened, and his eyes began changing to a blood red. "My friend Papagus has got a pretty big one. Ha ha! He was having a wardrobe fitted and the tailor said, 'I'm putting some extra space in your pants on the left-hand side,'" he said, laughing wildly by that time. He became like a child, clawing after the pretty lights that twinkled inside, and in his determination he wrenched the collider from my hand. It thumped him on the forehead, and dazzled by a flashing needle of light, he stumbled around with his breath coming very quickly. I watched a pair of cloven hooves clopping back and forth as he tried to steady himself on the brink of a burnout. After a while, he went very pale and quietly sat down on the cobbles, staring into space. He was shell-shocked, all right. I was startled by the sight of it, both hands ending in closed fists and his mouth contorted in a snarl. When his eyes swiveled to meet mine, there was a quick red glare in them. A trickle of blood ran from his nose. It was as though the metal door of a furnace had swung open and the flames were dying down. For a few moments, his eyes were opaque again, the eyes of an introvert, the eyes of a man who seldom looks out of the window, but is forever scrutinizing the scene inside himself. whilst craving a more cloistered lifestyle, and thoughtfully mumbling something about wanting to live in seclusion, bound by religious vows.